right, good morning. Well, Steve is out. As you guys saw in the video, he is in Latvia, working with one of our ministry partners there. And so we started a few weeks ago a series on emotions, right? And so emotions are universal. Everyone has them. Many of us express emotions differently. This is very evident to me between me and my spouse. We express emotions very, very differently, right? I'm very in touch with my emotions. It sort of flows out of me, like my emotions are I'm just always sort of like right there. I'm expressing myself very openly and honestly at all times, right? If you know me, you know that that's not true at all. But that's my wife, though. My wife is an emotional person. I never have to sort of like figure out if she's mad at me. That's never something I have to figure out. It's something that's plainly evident, right? It's there, and I can see it on her face. And she, even if she like tries to hide the fact that she's mad at me, it's just impossible for her. She just can't. I'm like, "You're mad at me," and she's like, "No." I'm like, "You're mad at me," and she's like, "Yes," right? And so many of us, we express emotions differently, right? But even me, I'm not an emotional person. I don't just like ooze or show emotions just outwardly usually, but I do. I have moments where that happens, right? I'm an Atlanta Falcons fan, so Super Bowl, if you were a fly on my wall in my living room, like, man, you would have seen the full range of Josh's emotions in that setting, right? And it would have been ugly. In fact, usually when I'm emotionally invested into a game like that, I watch it by myself, right? Because nobody needs to see that. It's ugly. But so many of us have sort of felt emotions that we feel and express, and then we have these emotions that are unfelt, that are felt but not necessarily expressed in an open way. And I think actually some of the most powerful emotions that we feel are emotions that are tended to not be just outwardly expressed. And I think shame and guilt is one of those emotions. That emotion is incredibly powerful for you and I, and we all feel it. We all carry it in some way, shape, or form, or have carried it in some way, shape, or form. And so here's a scenario. Let me give you an example of this. Here's how shame will automatically just make us uncomfortable, the idea of shame. So say I just had magical powers, and I could somehow transport your worst moment onto these screens for everyone in here to see, right? Say that was a possibility that I could do. Anybody cool with that? I'm going to guess no, right? And certainly not me. And even the thought of that for most of us, even just like envisioning that scenario just creates in us this like very negative, like visceral reaction, right? To our worst moment being uncovered and being seen by other people. It creates in us this very negative emotion, and it reveals the power that shame can have on us. Now, I will say from the outset that I don't think that shame is inherently evil. I think shame has a purpose for us. The purpose of shame is, in part, to reveal to us that something is not right. That something about us or something in us or something that we've done is not quite right. Because if we were to just live our lives however we want to, creating destruction around us, harming people around us, and we felt no shame, we felt no negative emotions when we surveyed the things that we did that were not good, and we knew they were not good, if we felt no emotion at all, we would have bigger problems, right? That's a bigger problem. But for most of us, if we let it, shame can be this horribly damaging emotional thing that slowly, over time, eats away at us. It's not a good thing. And many of us, we carry it, and it's with us. And just so you know, like as I prepare for these kind of messages, or any message I teach, I try to put myself in the position of the hearer, right? And so even as I was working through this, like talking about shame, talking about guilt, talking about things that bring us that, like that's not comfortable for me either. So like we're in this together, right? But I think the God's Word gives us some very clear and helpful things regarding shame that hopefully, man, we can take away and we can walk away from here and feel some healing, hopefully. That's my hope. And maybe feel some freedom for the first time. And so I'm gonna talk about some things that when it comes to dealing with shame, they're gonna be helpful for us. And the Bible helps us with. And so the first thing on your outline, first and foremost, step one is typically the hardest. Whenever you're starting something, step one is typically the hardest step. whether that's starting a new diet, whether that's starting a new exercise routine, whether that's starting any kind of new thing, step one is always the hardest. And for us, when we deal with shame, the first thing that needs to happen is that shame needs to be confronted. And the idea of confronting shame is not easy. It's not easy because we have this deep-seated tendency to take what brings us shame or take that shameful moment and wrap it up as tightly as we can and tuck it into some dark recess of ourselves where it's never talked about and never seen and never brought up. That's our tendency. And we'll find out that that's a tendency that the Bible describes for us and is very natural for us to do. But our tendency is not to confront shame, it's to bury it. It's to cover it up, is to act like it does not exist. I like Rosaria Butterfield. She's an author and talks about shame. She defines shame this way, and I think it's helpful for us. She says that shame is the self-loathing gut response to getting caught and knowing that God can judge us and knows us. So she ties shame in this very spiritual sense, which I think that's the appropriate way to do it. Shame has this deep spiritual tie with us, and that we know that we have done something wrong, and who we've wronged is actually God himself. And so it's this gut response, it's this gut feeling of knowing that God sees me and knows me. Everything. He sees and knows everything. And Steve said a few weeks ago that Genesis is foundational in understanding why we are the way we are, and I 100% agree. In fact, Genesis 3 illuminates a lot of things for us in regards to shame. And so Genesis 3, 7 through 10 says this. It says, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked." And so prior to this, God gives Adam and Eve himself, his creation, everything about himself. He gives that to Adam and Eve, and he gives them one command. He says, don't eat of this tree, this one specific tree, right? And we see Adam and Eve reject that and decide that that was not a reality that they wanted to live in, that their hopes and dreams for their own humanity were better, and so they disobey God, and we experience shame for the first time in human history right here. And as we continue, it says, "And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. Then the Lord God called to the man and said to him, 'Where are you?' And he said, 'I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and so I hid myself.'" And so again, shame had not been felt before this moment. You see, there are some emotions that we experience that we have because of who God is. That God has imparted us emotions because he is an emotional God. And so there are some emotions that we experience because we are a reflection of God's nature and character. And so being made in his image, we experience emotions like God does. And so the reason that we are able to feel any sense of joy, because we get that because of God himself. That God has imparted some of that to each of us because of us being made in his image. Shame is not one of those emotions. Shame is not an emotion that is given to us by God. It is the absence of God. Shame is sort of the product of what happens when we choose our own way and find ourselves in sin. Shame is the product of that. Shame is the absence of God. And so Butterfield's quote about shame fits here. It's this gut response for Adam and Eve of being caught and knowing that God knows them. And yet their response is still, because of this reality, because of this felt shame, their response is very telling, and it's very similar to how you and I respond to shame. They cover their most vulnerable parts. They cover the most vulnerable parts from each other. They cover the most vulnerable parts from God, and they hide. They hide. And this makes very little sense in light of who God is, right? This makes very little sense because God is God. God sees everything. He knows everything. And yet, because of this shame, because of this feeling that we feel, this thing being impressed upon us, our very natural inclination and reaction is to hide it, tuck it away, cover it up like it never happened. See, many of us have we have figurative fig leaves, right? We have figurative things that we put over what makes us feel most vulnerable. Maybe it's sort of this overt masculinity, Some of us are overtly masculine because we are trying to sort of mask our vulnerable parts. And so we put this thing out there that makes us look like a man's man. Many of us sort of go towards these tendencies of passive-aggressive behaviors. Maybe we're overly critical or overly negative to people we interact with and things that we experience because we're trying to we're trying to be less vulnerable. We're trying to hide these things that bring us shame. Typically, we want to prevent our source of shame from ever being exposed. And so we put these practices in place that our hope is to leave that tucked in where it's never seen and no one ever knows. All right, it's like covering a hole in our walls with a poster. I had a friend in college who, after we were talking about something that's dumb, right? Something that had no reason to be escalated in any sense of the word, and yet somehow it does. And he gets mad, and he literally punches a hole in his wall in his apartment, right? Hopefully you've never done that before, but if you have, it's a bad idea. So he punches this hole in his wall, and so instead of fixing it, the college kid in him just said, I'm going to cover it up with a poster, right? So he put a Pulp Fiction poster over this wall in his apartment, right, to cover this hole that he punched into it, right? Which, again, makes no sense because all it is you're just covering up a hole with something that really doesn't really do the job. And yet, for many of us, that is our approach to shame. And so one of the most helpful things that we can do in regards to shame is actually confront what brings us shame. Because sin thrives on shame. It grows on it. It continues on it. It knows our name. It lurks around. And so we have these holes inside of us that we've tried to just cover up with posters, and yet we know that that's not the real fix. That's not the real fix. Because one day my friend, he had to move, right? He had to move out of that house, and so at some point you either take the poster down and fix the wall, or you leave it there, and guess what? You're not getting your deposit back, right? You lose the deposit. And so it's going to cost you something either way. And this is true for you and I when it comes to shame. Confronting shame is much more helpful for us because there's a hole in the wall that needs to be fixed. And it's not going to get better. And if we don't fix it, it's going to cost you at some point down the road, which we'll get into. But when we have these holes in us, we have to fix them because that's what shame can do. Shame can create these compromising things in our spiritual walk that actually prevents us from being the people God wants us to be. And so we have to confront shame. Look, and I'm not telling you that that's easy. I'm not telling you that's fun. And I'm not telling you that that's like really clean, because it's not. When we talk about our shame, we talk about things that bring us shame. Of course, it seems very messy and it's painful and it's hard because you're having to uncover things, man, that you just don't want to uncover. You've got to address things that you have not addressed. And yet this is the beginning of healing, though. This is what brings us wholeness, is that we need to confront shame. We need to confront our shame. Next point is that, and this is an important one, this is why shame needs to be confronted, is because if we don't confront shame, shame will inevitably prevent us from moving forward. I love the book of Psalms. It's an emotional book. You see the emotional spectrum of the Psalms, and you see the Psalms about where they feel great and they feel close to God and they feel like God's presence is on them and His blessing is on them. And then one chapter later, you see where like there's nothing but despair and shame. And the Psalms that we're going to read right now is a psalm that's written out of shame, and it's Psalm 51. And it says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. And against you and you only I have sinned and have done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgments." And so there's key thoughts here. We see David describing this moment out of shame, and he points out some very clear things for us that you and I would know to be true. That as he experiences shame and as he walks through life, it says that his transgressions are ever before him. Meaning wherever he walks, this sin and this shame is in front of him. Wherever he goes, it's there. And he knows that his sin is really against God. And like Butterfield said, it's this idea of getting caught and knowing that God knows me, that God has seen it, and God can do what he wants. And so listen to David's plea here, though, after he realizes these things, because it's really helpful for us. He says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit." And check this part. This part is huge. "And then I will teach transgressors your way, and sinners will return to you." All right, so let's talk about shameful moments in human history. This Psalms comes out of one of the most shameful moments probably in biblical history. That David, before this moment, sees a woman that he desires sexually bathing on a rooftop. And this woman is married, but David does not care, and so he takes her and commits adultery with her, and then goes a step further and puts her husband in a position on the battlefield where he knew he would be killed. And then he takes this woman as his wife. And David is openly called out on this by the prophet Nathan, who stops him and says, "God knows what you have done." And out of that reality, out of that shame being exposed and confronted, David breaks, and this is the psalm that comes out of it. It is a prayer for God to fix this. And the reason the passage below, verses 10 through 13, are so important because it reveals to us that we can move forward when we actually confront shame. Because that's what David does in the first part of that passage. He actually confronts the idea that this happened and I messed up and it's my fault, and God, you are the only one that can fix this. David probably could have found a way to bury that. He probably could have found a way to make sure that sin and that event was covered up. He could have done it in his own heart, but he doesn't. He doesn't. He exposes it and he says, okay, this is what happened. I feel shame. It's here. It's in me. I feel it. And then he cries out. He says, God, please fix it. And the key part about that is that I love the way he talks about how he is going to move forward, how addressing his shame allows him to move forward. Because then he says, God, you've addressed my shame. You've given me a clean heart, a clean spirit, and now I will go and I will teach transgressors your ways. You know you have moved forward when you're ready to teach out of what brought you pain and shame. Like when you're ready to teach other people about that, you know that you are moving forward. If you don't ever confront those things, that part never happens. The part where you help people along in the things that you have dealt with and walked through never happens. We all just sit here and remain silent. One of the things that I saw as a student pastor, here's what's true about all of us. I think sexual sins bring about us the most shame and wounds. That's for sure in my experience, and I've seen that in the lives of students. But one of the most difficult things that I saw was that when a student would actually own that, and own that it was a problem, and own that they wanted to get it right and fix it, and they didn't know how to do that, and actually involved mom and dad in the process. One of the most difficult things that I saw was mom and dad being paralyzed because they felt like they couldn't. Because in that moment, they felt like, I can't do this. I can't help my kid with this because I struggled in this too. And I'm still carrying some weight. I'm still carrying some baggage here. I'm still carrying some shame here that I don't really want to dig up. And by addressing it with my kid, I'm having to, and I don't want to do that. You see, if we don't deal with shame and confront it, it actually paralyzes us from having extremely important conversations. It actually maybe prevent other people from finding the healing from shame that they so desperately want. You see, because God doesn't use perfect people. God doesn't wait until we are out of shame, that's far behind us, before He's going to use us. That's not what He's asking us. God's asking us to confront shame, own it, know what it is, and know who fixes it. Because when you do that, the second you do that, that's when you're able to move forward. And you're actually able to use your experience to draw people who are far from God because of their shame, who have run from God because of their shame, you might actually have the ability to grab that person and share your experience. And as David says, draw them close to God himself. You see, but most of us believe that we can't be fixed. We believe that this sin sort of defines us, that what brings us shame becomes this sort of unbreakable part of who we are. Look, and that's not the case. But shame can definitely prevent us from moving forward. And the third point is also an important one, and it's linked to this one, that shame can tell us that we are unfixable. That shame can tell us that we are actually unfixable, that what we are dealing with, the things that we've walked through, the things that we have done, aren't some sort of event detached from ourselves, but in fact, they're actually a part of who we are. That it's not that I've sort of done something bad in the past, but that I am actually, this is who I am. And so shame tries to convince us that this is an unfixable reality. Shame rarely stays in our past. If you walk through shame, you know that. Shame rarely stays in our past. It finds a way to wiggle its way into your present, and as David said, in how you see the future. David said, wherever I go, my transgressions seem like they're always in front of me. And wherever I walk, they're standing there looking at me. This is what shame does. And so we can believe and begin to think that shame has created this thing in me, and it's part of who I am now, and it cannot be fixed. There's a story in John about a blind man that's important for us. It's in John 9, verse 1. And it says, as he passed by, he saw a blind man from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. And we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, because night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva, and he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And so he went and he washed, and he came back seeing. And the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? And some said, it is he. And others says, no, but it is someone like him. But he kept saying, I am the man. And so they called to him and asked, how were your eyes opened? And he answered, he said, the man called Jesus made mud, anointed my eyes, and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. And so I went and washed, and I received my sight. And so there's this blind man, and the disciples are asking this question for a key reason. They ask, whose fault is it that this man is blind? Is it his fault or is it his parents' fault? Now, the reason they're asking that is because the sort of understanding of sin and shame and God at the time was that if you had some sort of physical ailment or something terrible happened to you, it was because of some sin that you had done. And so this kind of creates a quandary for them because this man is blind from birth. And so they're asking this question, did this man commit some kind of sin in the womb, or was it his parents' fault? You see, as they looked at this man, they saw that this thing, this sin, this blindness was sort of this, it was a very fixed point of this man's character. It was literally who he was. It had to be. Why else was he blind from birth? This had to have been something about him. That the reason he was experiencing this sin and this punishment was because it was an unfixable part of his character. He had done something so terrible that he had not repented from and had not moved on from. Therefore, this is who he was. And Jesus says, no, that's not really the way it works. And so imagine, put yourself in this man's shoes, the blind man's shoes for a minute. That growing up, literally, that was the message you received over and over again. Because you can imagine as a boy wondering why you're blind, why you're not like other kids, why you're not like other people, and being communicated to you over and over again that you've done something wrong. We don't know what it is. We don't know if it can be fixed. But you have done something wrong. I can imagine that it literally became a part of who he was. That reality, that sin, the idea of shame being on him for doing something wrong is something he carried with him his entire life. That for him, this was an unfixable reality because of something he had done. And yet Jesus shows us that this is not the case. And maybe you've had a similar experience. Maybe your difficulty with shame has to do with people telling you over and over again that you are this way because this is who you are. You are feeling this way. You do these things because this is who you are. The good news for this man was that he met Jesus. And that good news does not change for you and I. As we live life, as we deal with stuff, it's important to realize that we are not ever at a place that we are not fixable. We never come to a place where shame is terminal, that it can't be fixed. You see, it's the difference between treatment and terminal. When we get treatment, we know that, okay, if I follow these steps, I can be fixed. When we believe that we are unfixable, we believe that this is now who we are. There's no changing it. There's no fixing it. There's no going back. And we can't be fixed because a lot of times shame wounds us. And so we carry these wounds that we haven't actually addressed and we haven't actually uncovered. And so we're walking around wounded, and those wounds compound upon themselves because the more we try to get better, and the more we try to fix things, and the more we try to cover things up, the more and more we realize that we are inadequate to do that. That we can't do that. And that doesn't fix anything. And so it literally compounds our shame. We feel shame upon shame because we did something we feel shame for, and we feel like we can fix it, but we actually feel unfixable. And so we try harder and harder, and it leads us to this place of despair because we can't fix it. And that's the beauty of the gospel. Is the beauty of the gospel tells us that, no, you're not unfixable. You don't come to a place where you cannot be fixed. Jesus changed the reality and the identity of this man who had been blind for his entire life. Jesus can take you and your heart and life, and he can change you from the inside out. He can change your identity, reshape it. And so 3 R's as we sort of talk about what's the key to experiencing healing. And so we've seen a bunch of these already. First is repentance. And then it's remembrance and redemption. Remembering those 3 things are key to experiencing healing for shame, right? So first we go to repentance, and as David did, we own our shame. We own what brings us this pain. We call it out. We confess it. There's a tremendous power in just simply saying and addressing and uncovering the thing that we've tucked away so far and don't want exposed. There's tremendous power in bringing that to the surface and actually saying, okay, God, this is my mess. It's a mess that I've caused. It's a mess that I've perpetrated. Will you do something with it? Will you do something with it? And so repenting and confronting is one of the first things. And then we remember God's truth. And so once we do that, we remember the truth of God. We remember that as shame sort of tries to convince us that it shapes our identity, it becomes who we are, we remember the truth that no, the only person that can actually do that is Jesus. And that when I attach myself to Jesus and my identity is found in Jesus, I find this newness, this life that's filled with goodness and mercy, because this is who God is. And so God is able to take our nasty, crusty, shameful identity and make us something new. That's the story of Jesus. It's the story in the message that Paul sort of articulates in Romans 6. In Romans 6, verse 4, it says that we were therefore buried with him being Jesus, through baptism into death, in order that, just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. For we know that our old self was crucified with him, so that the body that was ruled by sin and shame might be done away with, that we would no longer be slaves to sin, because anyone who has died has been set free. And so Paul describes that our old self, that part that we think is so unfixable and is linked to shame and linked to things that we can't get away from, he says that no, that when you unite yourself to Jesus, when that sin and shame is attributed to Jesus and it's crucified with him. You want to talk about the importance of understanding why Jesus died? It is for this purpose. So that as Jesus is resurrected and his life is made new and he is new, he gives that newness to us symbolically and literally. We are made new. And And so God takes us from this sense of slavery and not being able to move on and not being able to really dig up our past and not being able to fix it. And he does it all for us. He does we can't. And he gives us all these adjectives that cannot coexist with shame. He calls us free and secure and no longer slaves. This is the good news of Jesus. And so one important aspect here is for us to realize that whatever that terrible moment that you envision was, no matter how bad you might think that is, it's not bigger than God. It's not bigger than the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's not bigger than the resurrection of Jesus. To make it so and to believe so is actually saying that, no, God, you're actually smaller than this. But the message of the Bible is that, no, God is big. He is bigger than this, and he's bigger than whatever you could think is this is an unshakable, unfixable thing about me. The message of Jesus is that, no, it's not. It's not. Jesus actually has the power to redeem your darkest moments. And so the question for you is that, do you believe that? Do you believe that God can redeem you at your worst? Because here's the truth. God doesn't turn away people who lay their hearts bare for him, who say, this is something that I've done and I can't fix it. God doesn't turn those people away. And so are you walking in shame? Have you tucked your shame so far away that it's been one of those things that has just never been dealt with? And that as you assess yourself, and if you're honest with yourself, you know that part of the way you live is a reflection of that. Part of the things that you do is out of compensating for that moment, or those moments, or those ongoing things. Confront that. Confront that and know that Jesus has the power to fix any situation you bring up. Because that's the only way we find healing. And so if you're feeling here that, okay, my past has been dictated by this, and I feel like my present is dictated by that, and my future is dictated by that, man, trust and believe and know that Jesus is bigger than that. And so my hope for us is that, again, sometimes exposing these things is painful, but as we expose these things, we find healing. And it's the healing that only Jesus Christ can offer us, and he offers it to you. Would you pray with me? Father, we're thankful for, first, your grace and mercy and your long suffering. And God, that you are a God who is patient with us. And that even if we've marched through sin and shame for years or even decades, Father, your promises don't end. They don't stop. They don't go away. So, Father, there are those of us in here who have dealt with shame and have walked in shame for a really long time. And for whatever reason, have no desire to confront it, no desire to bring it up, God, because it's painful. It's hard. So, God, I pray for courage first, that you would allow us to take that first step, that you would give us the courage to uncover the things that we've repressed and kept quiet for so long. And then, God, give us the belief that you are who you say you are. God, that we can move forward and we can be fixed. God, and through your grace and through your mercy, God, we can be made new. That those are your promises. So, Lord, I pray that those walking in shame and have never felt that freedom ever, God, would just turn to you, would cry out for you, and would call upon your name, Father. Thank you for the cross of Christ in which freedom is given and is attainable. So, Lord, we love you. Thank you for your goodness and your grace. And it's in Jesus' name. Amen.